Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm joined today by fellow therapist and author, Jay Stringer. Jay, it's good to see you.
Adam, it's good to see you as well. Good to be back.
We are going to talk about how our stories affect our sexuality, which is what we've talked about in the past. But let's start with this, Jay. Why even talk about sex and sexuality?
I think where I would begin with that is just the notion of, one of the things I write about in Unwanted is so much of the way that we talk about sex tends to be this sense of don't do it. So the analogy that I make is kind of just with regard to learning how to cook. Most of us are not going to learn how to cook through exclusively learning about food poisoning. So most people learn about sexual pathology, and some of the research that's been done would say that between K through 12, the average student will receive about 17.5 total hours about understanding their bodies, healthy sexuality, and then what makes it even more dire is to be a licensed mental health counselor like you and I, to be a medical doctor, any level of the professionals that you see, they are only required to maybe have one class in human sexuality in the entire duration of their training. And so that sense of if our leaders don't know what they're doing, all the research would also say that they have the same sexual difficulties that the rest of the population has. So I think that sense of there's an overwhelming amount of silence, and then just an overwhelming amount of just limited material out there to invite us to understand our sexual story. So I think all of that leads to, what Brené Brown said so simply and elegantly: shame needs three things to grow: secrecy, silence, and judgment. So a lot of us come into our sexual stories and our sexual lives with a lot of silence, a lot of secrecy, a lot of judgment, and therefore a lot of shame. And shame will kill creativity and curiosity every time.
In your book, Unwanted, one of your fundamental premises is that sexual struggles in the present are not random, that there's a reason for the particularity of each person's sexual struggles and sexual pain. And here's how you put it in the book. You say sexual problems are road maps. They pinpoint the location of past harm. What do you mean when you say that sexual struggles in the present pinpoint the location of past harm?
Yes, so I would say this is a big paradigm shift. Most of the time, when we see sexual problems, compulsive sexual behavior, hypoactive sexual desire, we tend to think that they reveal how broken we are. But the pivot that I always want to make is that sexual problems actually provide clues into the healing and the growth that we need. Therefore, so many of the sexual difficulties we face are always the most honest dimension of our life, because they're always revealing stories about where we come from, difficulties that we're facing that we don't know how to navigate through. So, just a couple brief examples from the research that I did. We found that men who had a lack of purpose in their lives were 7 times more likely to increase their involvement in porn. If you grew up in purity culture where your sexual desire was often pushed underground, the result of that could be, just a very secretive sexual life, or you tried to bury your sexual desire altogether in order to mitigate shame. And then we also found one of the really fascinating findings that I know I talked about on a previous episode, but a person's pornography search and their affair partner that they could pursue could be shaped, if not fully predicted, based on the unresolved parts of their story, their childhood, family of origin, adverse childhood experiences. So, that to me, when we started seeing that you could predict unwanted sexual behavior based on someone's story, that was such a wild discovery.
And as you point out in Unwanted, there are always two storylines at play. There's the storyline of our present sexual difficulties, pain, struggles. And then there is the storyline of your growing up experiences, which in some ways set you up for those present sexual struggles. And when I read that in Unwanted, what I think about is the language of Isaiah 61, because in Isaiah 61, what it's announcing is that the servant of God has been sent to bind up the brokenhearted and to proclaim freedom for the captives. And Jesus quotes this passage in Luke 4 at the beginning of his public ministry. And what he's saying is, I'm the one who has been sent to do those two things, to bind up the brokenhearted and to free the captives. But why I love Isaiah 61 so much is that Isaiah is making a linkage between your wounding, i.e., your broken heart, and your bondage, i.e., your captivity. There's a connection between your painful growing up experiences and your present sexual life. So you could take any present day sexual struggle, whether it's inordinate desire or if it's low, shut down, no desire, and you can draw an arrow from that struggle directly back to particular moments in your past story. All of that is to say this: sexual harm in the past becomes reenacted in the present. What do we mean, Jay, when we say things like sexual harm from the past becomes reenacted in the present? Flesh out that word reenacted.
So, when therapists talk about that term reenactment, I usually think about it in two different categories. One would be the repetition of a behavior, and the second would be a repetition of a core belief. So, an example of a reenactment that we might experience, I hear this story a lot. My dad or my brother kind of had a stack of porn, and it was hidden in kind of just a random place down in the basement. And then in the evenings, after the family would go to bed, they would go to the home computer or they would go to just find their family member's porn stash. And that would be a type of self soothing for them in the evening, kind of some level of disengaged family. And then they begin to go to that. And then lo and behold, they get married. And then they find out that their spouse is not always available to them, isn't always attuned to them. And they begin to go to pornography late in the evening after people have gone to bed. So that would be a type of reenactment. Or let's say that your past intersects with some type of sexual harm, sexual abuse. Well, that is going to create such a maddening and heartbreaking sexual template for you where you feel bonded to someone. You might feel aroused, you might feel disgusted, and then in the aftermath of everything that's experienced, you feel a lot of shame. Then, many years later, through adolescence, 20s, just a lot of those gray years of life, you might have a reenactment of those types of sexual experiences where you pursue something that is fairly arousing, maybe partially connecting, but then it always leaves you with a sense of like, what is wrong with me that I actually wanted this? That's what we mean by reenactment. The other category would just be the reenactment of a type of belief about oneself. So, if you were to think about what is the core message that shame attempts to convince me about myself, particularly in my sexual realm, am I too perverse, too sexual? Am I unwanted? Am I undesirable? If people really got to know me, they would want to have nothing to do with me. So, listen to that core belief that shame wants to convince you of, and then look at how your sexual behavior provides irrefutable evidence that the voice of shame is true. That's what we have to kind of be able to invite people into is, did you learn that negative belief in your family of origin? So some families can have very toxic messages about their kids, like you're too needy, you're too sensitive, you're too sexual, you're too rebellious, or they just abandoned them and then left something of the voice of shame and neglect to inform their core belief about who they were. Then, many years later, you begin to reenact just a lot of those core beliefs. And then the sexual behavior and sexual shame are essentially exhibit A in the courtroom against yourself.
There's a great couple of sentences in Unwanted where you say this. You say, despite the overwhelming grip of shame and guilt, I do not believe that sexual fantasies are something to condemn. Sexual arousal is one of the greatest gifts God has given us, and we do not need to spend a lifetime annihilating it. I love those two sentences. Why do
Mhm.
many of us get stuck in a war with our sexual arousal, with our sexual desire? And why do many of us respond to our sexual struggles by trying to kill or numb out or decrease our sexual desire?
I mean, where I would begin is most of us don't really see that our unwanted sexual behavior, our sexual fantasies, have so much to teach us. So, I mean, even if we take this outside of sex for a moment, virtually no symptom is ever going to resolve until it's taught you what you need to know. So, if you're struggling with anxiety or anger, that anxiety and anger is actually trying to be something of a clarion call to alert you to what's going on. So, a lot of us, when we see something about ourselves, we hate it. And therefore, we try to manage it, we try to kill it. And so I think, that's the nature of desire is desire tends to be one of the most disruptive forces. When I look back at my life, desire is responsible for all the beautiful moments in my life, but desire also brings me to a sense of betrayal. It brings me to a sense of just a lot of conflict around the drives and the desires within me. When we look at, okay, desire might lead me to betrayal, desire might lead me to a perverse thought, desire might lead me into just a wild, unpredictable terrain, it becomes much easier to try to contain it, to manage it, in the hopes that we can begin to change through some level of self hatred and management. Because I think all of us recognize that freedom is terrifying. I think of like some of the prisoners that escaped the Soviet gulags. When they escaped, many of them actually ran back into prison. And what they said was, freedom is not actually for us. And so I think desire is terrifying. And so most of us live with a civil war of desire rather than really learning how to bless what our desire is ultimately pointing towards.
All right, one more quote from Unwanted that I found really helpful. One of the things you claim is, quote, if we are willing to listen, our sexual struggles will have so much to teach us. And I love that. It's not just a sentence. It's a reframing of what torments so many people.
Mm.
You're inviting us to listen, as you put it, to our lust. But you could even broaden that and just say to listen to our sexual struggles, because lots of people, they don't struggle with lust, they struggle with a shut down sexuality. But this idea of listening to our sexual pain, our sexual struggles, with the hope that it can teach us something is a really hopeful sentence. But what do you mean by it?
So, what I mean by that is this is the invitation to curiosity. So, one night, one day long conference that is going to invite you to be curious is going to take you further than 1,000 nights of prayerful despair or accountability or internet monitoring. A lot of times when we approach sexual difficulties, I would say the conservative crowd tends to try to manage it. Accountability, willpower, slap rubber bands around your wrist, contain, contain, contain. But a lot of times when you look at, just Cosmo, Men's Health, social media influencers, the other category would just be that of like mastery. So they're going to teach you tips and techniques to try and escape your sexual story. But the problem with that is that it doesn't ever lead to self development. It doesn't ever lead to a level of grief with regard to, what was my story? How did that affect my sexual story? So, both the conservative and many of the progressive frameworks really allow us to escape our story. And so, this sense of really inviting people to say, what could you learn through deliberate curiosity with your fantasies, with your struggles? And just, that drum that I keep hitting over and over again is we have so much to learn from the difficulties of our lives. And I hate that that is true, but in a way, I have to thank some of my pathology, some of my difficulty for a lot of growth and a lot of strength that I've been able to find in life. And why is that the case? I don't know. But it is. Difficulty is the crucible for growth.
Can you talk a little bit about how our sexuality is related to our family of origin story? Because one of the fundamental claims here is that your sex as a 40-year-old, as a 50-year-old, your sexual struggles, your sexual expression, your sexuality is linked to your story as a 7-year-old boy, a 14-year-old girl. That's one of the claims. What are some of the ways that, for example, a dysfunctional family system might affect one's sexuality? Help us draw the connection.
One way I might put it is that your mother and father were the steward of the desires that God has given you. So when you begin to think about how did my family honor my desire? Did they indulge it? Did they never attend to it? Even without talking about sex, if we were to just talk about food or fashion, did your parents ever invite you to say, "What do you like to eat?" What types of foods kind of make you feel comfort? What types of foods actually bring you a sense of freshness and rejuvenation? A lot of clients might say, we didn't have a lot of money and my parents were just extremely selfless people. But they always bought their school clothes and then they had no choice in the matter. And so, part of the question is, that's not selfless. I mean, I get that they sacrificed a lot to be able to fill this wardrobe, but they never invited you to like what types of shoes or, we have $50, $100 for a back to school budget for you. How do we want to spend it? So just that basic thing of how did your mother or father invite you to desire, or did they just seal that off? Did they make you pay for the desires? Because desire is always disruptive. When my wife Heather has a desire, I don't like it initially. Why? Because if she changes, I have to change. If she wants something, that's going to affect my schedule. So desire is disruptive in every family. So then it becomes the question of how did they engage it? And so the three categories that I work with most often in my clinical practice is just a rigid family, a disengaged family, and maybe an enmeshed relationship with a parent. So don't want to go into too much detail there, but rigid families, rules, regulations, lots of control, just a sense of almost making you pay for your desire. But simultaneously, you're watching a lot of hypocrisy because maybe your mom or your dad were so rigid that only their desires were met. And so, just that sense of if you don't have a family system that honors your desire within the home, guess what? You're going to have to find an escape route in order to live in an indulged desire, oftentimes through something like porn, hookups, drugs, just some way of escaping that rigid structure. The other category would be just that of a disengaged family. So, a disengaged family is when a mother, a father are too preoccupied with their work, maybe with the cleanliness of the house. So, their desires, their eyes might be on another child in the family, they might be on another career path. And so, essentially, what happens there is that you learn again that family is not a place where I'm going to be seen and delighted in within my desire. I'm going to have to go out looking for it in the rest of the world. And sometimes that can remain operative even as you get married later in life. And then the other third category would just be an enmeshed family. And that's often where you have a triangulated relationship with your mother or father and you learn how to have a sixth sense for the desires of their heart. That you know that if you inquired about their day, asked to go on some type of outing with them, that that would just bring them so much relief. You knew that some of the difficulties that were existing in their marriage, and you knew that your presence, your face could offer something of a balm to your mother or father. Well, what you learn in that is, that might not be sexually abusive in the most easily understood term, but that is affecting your sexual development. So, within my story, I know some for you, Adam, like my triangulated relationship with my mom taught me how to anticipate the needs of women. I was really good at doing that for my mom. And that began to play out in a lot of my sexual fantasy life and even porn searches later. But I had never made that link between the style of relating that I learned with my mom is actually it mirrors so much of my sexual fantasy life. And when I saw that, it was just like, oh gosh, it would have been almost preferred for me to just think that I am a perverse man than to understand how much my mom influenced my sexual life.
Yeah. I mean, the fact of the matter is, we are not fond of looking deeply at our growing up experiences, at our roles and relationships in our families of origin. And it's because looking at that stuff is fraught and it stirs up, it disrupts, it's hard. And for many of us, we're still in relationship with the two people that brought us into this world and that raised us. And looking at how they may have failed us as children in particular ways can be very disruptive for our present day relationships with them. So it's not an easy thing to look at your growing up experiences and name some of these dynamics. But if you want to understand your present day sexual struggles, you've got to take an honest, eyes wide open look at what it was like for you as a boy or a girl in your particular home with your particular sibling configuration, or if you were an only child. But you've got to look at those dynamics and name what was true for you. So we're talking about a lot of different things. And one of the reasons we're doing this podcast is because Jay and I are co-leading a virtual conference coming up. It's going to be Saturday, April 30th on this topic. So if you want more detailed discussion about how our past story affects our present sexuality, you may want to check out the Sexual Attachment Conference. That's the name of it. It's taking place over Zoom Saturday, April 30th. It will be from 11 to 6 Eastern Time, which is 8 to 3 Pacific. And during the conference, Jay and I will share teaching segments that will help you connect the dots between the sexual difficulties you face and your earliest attachment relationships, your growing up experiences. We will dive in much more depth into family systems, sexual arousal, and how to transform your sexual story. So you can sign up by going to sexualattachment.com. That's the conference website. Or you can go to my website, adamyoungcounseling.com, and find a link there. So sexualattachment.com or adamyoungcounseling.com. Let me share a brief outline of the conference. What are we going to engage on April 30th? Here's an outline of it. We'll begin by talking about attachment, secure attachment, ambivalent attachment, avoidant attachment. If these categories are new to you, we will flesh them out in depth, but they are very important when it comes to understanding how you relate to other people, especially to romantic partners. And I will take time to explain what I call the big six, which are the six things that every child needs from their parents in order to develop what's called a secure attachment. And briefly, what those big six things are is attunement. You needed attunement from your parents. Responsiveness is number two. The third is engagement. The fourth is you needed your parents. Every kid needs their parents to be able to interactively regulate their affect. And we'll talk about affect and what it is. The fifth thing that kids need is they need their parents to be strong enough to handle their big emotions like sadness, fear, shame. And the sixth thing, and in many ways the most important, is you needed your parents to be willing to repair when they harmed you, to repair the rupture that happened in the relationship. So by looking in depth at these six areas, you will get a pretty good idea of how you attached to your parents, to each of them. And then we will look at how each attachment style plays out in your present sexual life. So, your sexual difficulties now are in many ways a function of your attachment wounds. Remember Isaiah 61, that there's a linkage between your broken heart and your present captivities. So your attachment wounds are very related to your present sexual expressions, sexual experiences. To say it differently, securely attached people experience sexuality very differently than avoidantly attached people and very differently than ambivalently attached people. And I'm just going to say a few words about each of these, but we'll flesh it out in much more depth on April 30th. When you are ambivalently attached, your sex life is in many ways about reassuring yourself that you're loved, truly loved, and welcomed and embraced by your partner. So, for example, if your spouse says no to sex that night or no to what you want to do sexually, you are likely going to experience some degree of anxiety or panic. It may be mild, it may be severe. Why? Because as far as your nervous system is concerned, your spouse is not merely saying no to sex, they're communicating to you that they don't really care about you and your needs. And I'm not saying that that's what your spouse really feels, but as an ambivalently attached adult, you're going to experience their no very differently than a securely attached adult. And their no is going to trigger your anxiety that your partner is not really there for you. They don't really care about your needs and your wants. Now, contrast with that an avoidantly attached person. An avoidantly attached adult is, this is not the only thing that's true about their sexuality, but it's often true. You are apt to avoid emotional closeness during sex with your spouse. Sex per se is not a problem for you. It's just sex with someone that you are in an emotionally committed relationship with. When there's a pairing of emotional intimacy and physical sexual intimacy, that can be difficult for you. It can be challenging. Why? Because you have an emotional connection with your spouse. And so sex with your spouse requires emotional intimacy. And if you are avoidantly attached, emotional closeness can be scary for you because it connects you to your unmet needs for emotional closeness in your family of origin, your unmet needs for emotional connection with your parents, because that was not there for you. When it comes to fantasy, both avoidantly and ambivalently attached people will tend to use fantasy and or pornography, but for oftentimes different reasons. And we will go into those sorts of things during the conference. So Jay and I, we did this conference last year. We've made some tweaks to it, some changes, some additions. And one of the things we want to do this year is we want to make this as practical as possible. So throughout the conference, we will be sharing some of our personal stories, but also lots of vignettes, client vignettes that illustrate the linkage between present sexuality and past stories of sexual harm. After I teach on attachment and the big six, we will invite you to take 30 minutes to complete a written exercise that is designed to help you understand with particularity and specifics, like what it was like for you in your particular family. So you'll take 30 minutes to do this exercise that will be emailed to you. After that, Jay is going to teach about family systems and how various forms of harm set you up for sexual difficulties down the road. And I will follow that with a discussion of triangulation. Jay mentioned that that was part of his story. It's part of my story. It's very important to understand in your family how you were triangulated or how one of your siblings may have been triangulated. And all forms of triangulation lead to a discussion about subtle sexual abuse. And so I'll talk about that, what it is, and why it matters in terms of your sexual development and your sexuality as an adult. Then you will get a much needed lunch break. And after lunch, Jay will teach about why it's so difficult to change and some of the strategies that are embedded within sexual desire difficulties. Everyone wrestles with sexual desire at some point in their life. Everyone. And Jay is going to teach about what is the meaning of our unwanted sexual behavior, or what is the meaning of a sexual life that is shut down and turned off, what's called hypoactive desire. We will end the conference by talking about what is involved in the path to healing and change. Like, what does that look like? And then we will share some resources for next steps on the journey. During last year's sexual attachment conference, one of the pieces of feedback we got is that people wanted to know about hypoarousal. That is, people who were struggling not with unwanted sexual behaviors, but who were sexually shut down. They didn't have any sexual desire. And we are going to spend more time this year addressing this, Jay in particular. So, Jay, can you just shed a little bit of light on what might be happening for folks who have a shut down sexuality or little to no desire?
I will, but I just hearing the outline of the conference made me so excited to do it again this year. So I can't wait to do it. So, yes, really grateful for the feedback from last year's conference. And I would say it's one of those things that I'm hearing more and more about, and that is hypoactive sexual desire. And so, what we know, depending on the research that you're looking at, is that it affects somewhere between 10 to 30% of women and men, with women experiencing it slightly more. So, in the intensives that I offer to men and women, I would say that I've observed four fairly common drivers with regard to low sexual desire in men and women. And so I'm going to unpack those four in much more detail during the conference, but want to give you just a brief preview of them. The first one would be hypoactive sexual desire is something that could be a form of protest. So, a lot of times when you are involved in a more enmeshed marriage or kind of romantic relationship, sometimes you feel like you are under just a lot of control of how much money you spend, about, are they attuned to you? Are they not? And your whole life can kind of feel like you're under some level of control. And so, therefore, a lack of sexual desire, I would say, makes complete sense. How is it possible for you to desire someone who has something of, not complete control, but so much control over almost virtually every element of your life? And so that sense of being able to say no to sexual arousal, to orgasm, may be your only no that you feel like you have left within the relationship. So we want to always privilege and understand that hypoactive sexual desire might be something of a form of protest. I would say another key driver, the second key driver that I observe, would be that it is a signal of past harm. So sometimes when you have been through something of an adverse childhood experiences like sexual abuse, one of the things that happens is that, Bessel van der Kolk talks about this a lot, where a lot of abuse victims feel a lot of shame for how aroused or out of control they felt during their own abuse. And so, if that is true of you, sometimes you can try to turn off your sexual desire in the hopes that you don't ever have to re engage issues of desire or open yourself up to future harm. So, again, want to invite you to a more compassionate understanding of there is meaning embedded within low sexual desire. Another category that I see more and more would be a way of protecting your man's ego in the case of something like erectile dysfunction. I'll get into the statistics, but we're seeing much more erectile dysfunction and premature ejaculation in men. So, therefore, sometimes men unwittingly condition their spouses to just be fairly unenthusiastic. Why? Because if they get going, if they get too passionate, the sex that they were having as a couple is over. So sometimes that sense of almost a sense of being conditioned
Mhm.
to just not be too aroused in the bedroom definitely plays out. And then the fourth category that we'll explore would just be a sign of sexual shame. So this could be true if you went through something like purity culture, or maybe you had, a lot of your teens and 20s were just a lot of hooking up, a lot of promiscuity, but you live with just some civil war with regard to desire, that you want to be someone that desires, but then also you look at the debris of your sexual life and you're like, what is wrong with me? Well, when you feel sexual shame, sometimes you can just try to bury it so that it never gets, or you can try and bury sexual desire so it never gets out of control. So each of those four things we'll go into more detail about, and maybe some client stories with regard to just those vignettes so that you can really see how they play out over a lifetime.
Some people are probably wondering if this year's conference will be different than last year's. And we can say this: much of the content will be a repeat of last year, but it will be different in a couple of ways. First is what Jay is talking about now, which is that we're going to spend more time talking about low or no sexual desire. Second, we're going to be more specific and precise about how present sexual struggles are linked to past stories. So we're going to give a lot more examples, vignettes, kind of case studies, if you will, that show the linkages. And then the third way is we're going to have some teaching around how to talk to a friend or significant other about your sexual story and about how you can rewrite the script of your current sexual story with that person. Before we end, Jay, can you just share a little bit about who would be interested in attending this conference?
I would say individuals that are struggling with some level of sexual shame, or just want to understand and transform their sexual story. If you're like me, just did not receive too much sex education or emotional mental health education. So it's just going to be really good for you to understand your own sexual story. One of the things that we've been encouraged by, even by pre-registration so far, is just there's a lot of marriages and relationships that are signing up in order to understand their spouse's sexual story, their sexual story. The image I always think about is like when two rivers come together, that confluence is going to be the most powerful portion of that river. And that's what marriage can often be, is two sexual stories and templates coming together.
Mhm.
And then it's like, what in the world is going on? So we would love for you as couples to be able to sign up for this. In Brené Brown's most recent book, she quotes, I believe, a German philosopher who says, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. And I think that's going to be hopefully a really powerful point of this conference, is that a lot of couples come in with no language to be able to talk about why they fail, why they struggle, why they resist sexual arousal. So our hope is that there's just a lot of invitation to language, to understanding just a very different framework. Leaders, we would love for seminaries, for counseling teams, for therapists, for if you are in leadership position. Just going back to that point, I know from my own seminary days and grad school days, I have two master's degrees, one class in human sexuality. That was it. So this would be a great way to learn more, because if you don't understand your own sexual story, you're not going to be terribly good at equipping others to understand theirs. So if you're a leader, sign up. And then we've also been hearing some stories about small groups that are signing up as well. So I heard from a women's group and a men's group that they're going to take getting like a Airbnb weekend away just to go and listen to the conference on Saturday. And then Sunday, they're going to further discuss and unpack that. And so when I heard that, I was like, that is such a fabulous way of doing this in community. Because a lot of times you just don't want to be in a church basement discussing, you know, sexual shame and compulsivity. Like, do it with your friends so that you all can kind of develop your language and an understanding of one another's story. So we want everyone to attend, would be the summary of that.
And I think the main thing I want to say as we end is that Your sexual story matters, and there is a reason that you have the sexual problems, difficulties that you have now in your present life. It's not random. And there really needs to be a posture of both kindness and curiosity when it comes to how you're engaging your present sexual difficulties. Because, as Jay mentioned earlier, there's kind of the conservative and the progressive approach to sexual difficulties, and frankly neither one is very helpful when it comes to transformation. Looking at your past story, in our opinion, is a necessary part of understanding your present sexuality. And that needs to be done with kindness and curiosity towards yourself as a boy or a girl, because your sexuality developed, it took root, it began when you were an early adolescent. And at that time, you were in a home. And whatever your home was, sexuality was present in it. That's where you learned about your sexuality. And much of that learning has to do with the categories of just delight and desire. So we want to explore your family of origin. We want to invite you to understand your family of origin and link it to your present sexuality. That's our hope. That's our pastoral heart for you if you attend, is that there would be a compassionate stance, because there has been so much war in so many people when it comes to addressing their sexuality. Jay, I know you agree with all that because I got it from Unwanted, but anything you want to add?
I think the only thing that I would add to that is the way the wounds of the past are resolved is in our present engagement to the grief of our stories and in our integrity to actually choose something much more beautiful, good, and true with regard to our lives. So I think anytime we're looking at rigid families or our own rebellion or sexual shame, sometimes those are clues that we needed to bust out of our family of origin. The complexity is almost every single way that we learned how to make our life work as a result of trauma actually compounds the difficulties that we're in. But one of the most powerful things that I think about with regard to sex reveals where we've been, it reveals who we are, and it is also the stage where we are able to rewrite so much of our story. So we want you to engage the past, but we also want you to see that this realm of sex and sexuality is the stage, the very terrain that you can be able to rewrite the story that you have longed for, but never believed that you could actually find.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Just as a reminder, the Sexual Attachment Conference, the second annual Sexual Attachment Conference, is Saturday, April 30th. And you can sign up at sexualattachment.com or adamyoungcounseling.com.